Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Today we continue our discussion about the Gospel of Mark. This is part 13 of a series. Welcome to everybody that's gathered here today, and for those that may hear this message at a future time. We begin with Mark 7:26 through 29, and we are asking if this idea of throwing children's food to dogs, is it historical? Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him, Jesus, to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying in the bed, and the demon gone. What does this mean? So Jesus in some way becomes acquainted with a Gentile. What is a Gentile? A Gentile is anybody that is not a Jew. So a Gentile is the outsiders to the Jewish religion, to the Jewish culture. And this woman was of Syro-Phoenician origin. And it seems, according to the story, that her daughter was possessed by some kind of unclean spirit, here translated as demon. And Jesus is recorded as having said, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." What does that mean? The children are the Jewish people of Israel. The dogs are everybody else that's not Jewish. And although we love dogs nowadays, and my dog is like my daughter, literally, back then, in many countries, dogs were considered more of pests than beloved family members, sadly enough. And that's what we're recording here is Jesus saying, "Let the children be fed first. Let the Jewish people receive my teachings, receive my healings, receive my exorcisms first. For it is not fair to take the children's food, the Jews' food, and throw it to the dogs, people that are non-Jews." But she, the woman, answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So she seems to not be insulted by this statement that Jesus is saying, and instead she faithfully says that even lowly dogs eat from the crumbs of their human owners, or humans that are superior than dogs. So the crumbs that fall from the Jews onto the floor, we want to eat that. The crumbs of your teachings, the crumbs of your healings, the crumbs of your exorcisms. And then Jesus purportedly said to her, "For saying that, for having such humility, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So it was this humility and this faith and receptivity to Jesus that allowed Jesus to cast out a demon from a distance. So this is a different kind of exorcism. In the prior exorcisms in the Gospel of Mark, the person who was experiencing the exorcism was present with Jesus. In this case, Jesus did a long distance exorcism. He was able to cast out the demon with the child not even being near him. And this was resultant from her faith in Jesus' power to exorcise demons, and also for her noted humility. And it is true, Jesus did come to teach his message to fellow Jews. But did Jesus say this kind of statement? Most great masters throughout history that I can think of. They were born in a certain area and they preached to the people of their area. They came for that area, for that demographic, for their people, in most cases. It's only in modern times now that great masters' teachings of the past are changing people's lives and spiritual perspectives all over the world. My great living spiritual master travels all over the world to give a spiritual message, not just to her culture, but to all cultures. It's generally accepted that Jesus came to preach to the Jews. It was later on Paul and Peter that decided to extend Jesus' message to the Gentiles. And Gentiles, again, are people other than the Jews, other nations other than Israel. But here we see Jesus saying something that's really kind of strong. Let the Jews be fed first, my children. For it's not fair to take the Jews' food, my children's food, and throw it to dogs. Would Jesus really say something like this? I've had the good fortune of having a true spiritual master, and she would never, ever say such a thing. Never. And I believe that Mar Yeshua was truly a spiritual master too. So I don't believe he believed this. Every spiritual master knows that God resides equally in the hearts of all people, of all nations, of all races, of all religions. God resides in all. Every master knows this. And because of that, all people are essentially equal. So I don't believe that Jesus would have said, let the children be fed first because we can't throw the children's food to dogs. I don't believe he said it. I believe it's something that the writers of the Gospel of Mark wrote. If Jesus said this, if he said it, it was to test her humility and not just because he was ignorant of high spiritual philosophy that we've already stated. He may have said it to provoke her, to see if her faith remained strong, if she still had humility. If he said it at all, it would have been in that spirit. But it is true that historically many Jews felt themselves superior to all nations, that their God was superior to all their gods, etc. And Jews weren't necessarily monotheistic. They believed in many gods. They believed that Yahweh was the God of Israel. But they also believed that other countries had other national gods. So it wasn't that they were necessarily monotheistic, it's that they thought their God was best. Right? My God is better than your God. My mom is better than your mom. My karate is better than your karate. So a lot of Jewish people may have thought this way. But if Jesus was truly a spiritual master, he would not have thought this way. And again, if he said this, it was to test her humility and her receptivity and her willpower to seek an exorcism for her daughter. Healing the deaf man, very interesting story. Mark 7:32-36 records, they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him, Jesus, to lay his hand on the deaf man. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephata, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. So there's some really interesting things here. People in the modern age may doubt that Jesus healed anybody. I mean, he stuck his fingers in somebody's ears and he could hear. He spat on his fingers and then touched the tongue, and the man's speech impediment went away. Modern people of this day and age may doubt this, but it's true. I do believe this is historical. Again, the vast majority of humanity doesn't have an opportunity to meet great saints, great mystics, great illuminated beings. I have had the good fortune of meeting several of them, the greatest of which is my living spiritual master. But I've met several that are quite evolved and quite superior to the human race in mass. One such man I met is a master of Qigong, which is it's the discipline of the air, the discipline of the life force. And he taught me a technique for helping people that were hard of hearing. And guess what the technique did? Amongst other things, you would point your fingers into the ears of the person, and you would send very strong thought patterns of healing from your consciousness to the consciousness of the other person. It wouldn't be spoken out loud, but you would radiate a type of life force energy, a bioelectric energy, from your fingertips into the ears of the person. And I was taught how to do this, and I was very skeptical as to whether it would work or not. But later on, I met a woman who was very hard of hearing because she had ringing. I believe it was in her right ear. So I did the technique because she could barely hear due to this ringing of the right ear. And I did the technique the man had taught me, and it worked. So this is very similar to what Jesus did with sticking his fingers or putting his fingers into the deaf man's ears and healing him. He projected some kind of healing energy mixed with healing thought, which opened the man's ears. So I can say from personal experience that this is definitely a possibility. If I can do it, then definitely somebody like Jesus can do it instantaneously without worry or doubt. The second part of the healing was that Jesus spat onto his fingers, his saliva, and touched the man's tongue, and the speech impediment went away. This seems very odd, right? However, when a spiritual master is fully reborn, when somebody is spiritualized, illumined, a great saint, everything about them is sacred. There's a special power, even within their saliva. And my spiritual master, she said that even the saliva of a saint is healing. So Jesus used his saliva, knowing it was surcharged with spiritual power of his practices and his realization, and he touched the tongue and healed him. Again, in modern times, a very dramatic interpretation of this, and there are videos of it online that you can look at. My spiritual master in the earlier days of her ministry on earth, she came across a leper in India. And yes, there are still lepers in India, unfortunately. I've even heard in recent times that there are cases of leprosy breaking out in the United States, even in the 2020s, right? So it's not a dead disease. But in any case, my teacher receives people through hugging. She blesses people by hugging them, and then possibly giving spiritual advice, so on and so forth, as is appropriate per person. And in those days, the leper would wait outside because people were afraid that he was contagious, obviously. And one day after she'd seen everybody, she asked for him to come forward. After she'd already touched everybody, interacted with everybody, blessed everybody, she invited the leper to come last, knowing she would touch him, probably with her hands. But she did something very different. She had him take off his tunic, or his, what's it called? Kurta. His kurta, which is like the Indian top that they wear. And it was very hard for him to take off the kurta because it was hot and he was sweating, and his sores from leprosy were oozing pus. And my teacher had him take off his shirt while people were witnessing this, and it was being video recorded. Again, you can witness it today if anybody wants to see it. Give me a comment and I'll send you a link of the video. And what she did was she used her own saliva to clean out his wounds. So she would use the tip of her tongue to lick the pus out of each of his seeping leprous wounds. And she did that on several occasions, not just one time, but many times. And the first time people witnessed this, they began to vomit. I mean, imagine, she was literally out of the wounds of a leper's wounds come pus and blood, and she was licking it out. And what she said afterward was that she was medicating those wounds with the saliva of her tongue. So for those that do great spiritual practices, especially those who have become one with God in consciousness, like Jesus, like my blessed Master, even their saliva has great healing power. And that leper is still alive today, and all that he has in his body are scars where the leprosy wounds had healed. But he was free from leprosy, I believe, after 3 of these treatments. So it wasn't just one treatment that my teacher gave him with her saliva. It was several. I believe at least 3, but I'm not sure. So it wasn't something quite so instantaneous like what is recorded here with Jesus. Depending on the receptivity of the ill person, a great master can heal instantaneously, or sometimes it could take several so-called treatments. But again, based off of these experiences with 2 different spiritual masters, one that taught me about healing, and my spiritual master who taught me about living a good life, both of these things that Jesus did, I've witnessed having reality even in these days, in these times. So this type of healing can be done by people that are capable of doing it. Beware of yeast. Here we have to the right a bread rising from yeast that has been put into the batter. So we use yeast to make bread rise from flat dough into a nice fluffy loaf of bread. In Mark chapter 8:15, Jesus, cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, be aware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." So the Pharisees, Jesus contended against because he felt they had a lot of man-made laws. He felt that they were asking people to do things which they did not do themselves. So he felt them to be insincere spiritual teachers, that they would take money for nothing, essentially. It's often quoted that Jesus would call them hypocrites, but there was actually no Hebrew word for hypocrite. There wasn't a tradition of theater in ancient Israel. So the word that most likely was used for hypocrite by Jesus would have been Baseaf, I believe is the Hebrew term. Pardon me if I just butchered it. Bea Seif, which means to look down. Nasa Baef, I believe it is. Nasa Baef. My memory is coming back. Nasa is nose. Baef. Nasa Baef means to look down your nose at somebody. So it wasn't that Jesus thought they were hypocrites. Jesus criticized the Pharisees because of their spiritual pride. They thought they were spiritually better than other people. And that's what Jesus criticized the Pharisees for. He felt that they had a lot of man-made laws that weren't really in line with Torah, or that they weren't a correct interpretation of Torah from Jesus' viewpoint. So he was telling his disciples here, just watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Be aware of what spreads and grows from the Pharisees, which is their teachings. So Jesus wanted his disciples and his hearers to follow his message, which was an interpretation of the heart of Torah, not the letter of the Torah. So he was more interested in a heart-based interpretation of Scripture rather than trying to beat out meaning from every letter and every word and really grinding it and forcing people to do these odd rituals and things that Jesus felt the Pharisees weren't even doing themselves. So because he was asking them to do things that they probably wouldn't do or do correctly, he felt that the Pharisees weren't letting people into heaven and they'd thrown away the keys. He says something along those lines in Matthew. And he said, also be careful of the yeast of Herod. Herod was a traitor to the Jews. Herod was a Jew, but he was installed by the Roman governance, the Roman Empire. So he was kind of a turncoat, if you think of him like that. And Herod was also responsible for beheading John the Baptist, who is the likely teacher, spiritual master of Jesus. So he said, just beware of the yeast of Herod, becoming a traitor, becoming a turncoat. So the Jews were very much wary of the Romans. They were very wary of Herod and the Herodian family because they were in bed with the Romans. And that's also why tax collectors are so looked down upon in the Christian Testament, because the tax collectors were tax collectors employed and paid by the Roman Empire. So Jewish tax collectors, like Saint Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, were often detested and seen as being in bed with the Romans. So Jesus is saying, don't let the yeast of the teachings of the Pharisees rise and expand within you. Focus on what I'm teaching. And beware the yeast of Herod, of being a traitor to your own country. And also all the other bad qualities of Herod. Violence, beheading John the Baptist, jealousy and envy. Herod also was very jealous and envious of the spiritual power that John the Baptist had over Herod. He even criticized Herod. And that's what got him beheaded, ultimately. So Herod represents all kinds of negative things. He's like a human Satan. So beware of all these negative qualities embodied in Herod. Don't let them take root in your heart and your mind. And beware of these inefficient spiritual Pharisaical teachings that have no basis in opening your heart to God and oneness with God. In fact, those man-made teachings of the Pharisees will lead you away from the spiritual goal. So these were some warnings that Jesus gave. And likely, this phrase from Mark is probably quite historical. Human trees. Mark 8, 22 through 25. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. So here we see Jesus giving two treatments. Unlike the first man whose blindness seemed to be healed, unlike the first man whose hearing and his speech impediment seemed to go away quickly, this man needed 2 treatments that Jesus gave one after the other. And again, we see the idea of Jesus using his saliva. Jesus puts his own saliva as an ointment in the man's eyes and then laid his hands on him. And he said, "Can you see anything?" after he was done applying his saliva and his hands for the purposes of spiritual healing. And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." In other words, his vision was still blurry. He couldn't see people properly. And what he may have been seeing was people's bioenergetic fields, their aura. Because it is said by many spiritual beings of different traditions that the human aura and the aura of a tree are very similar, and that they look very much alike. So maybe he was starting to see some energy patterns or different light receptors in his eyes began to spark up and wake up, and perhaps he was able to see some energetic fields. Or maybe it was just blotches of people because it wasn't fully healed yet. And because he couldn't see yet, Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored. So after 2 treatments, the man was able to see again. And again, I believe this is quite historical. We already talked about saliva, and laying on of hands is a very popular approach to healing people. You don't necessarily even have to touch somebody to heal them. Your hands can be above the body part that is damaged, ill, or hurting. And by learning certain methods, you can transfer healing energy from the hands into an ailing body part. In this hands-on healing, there are many methods in modern times. So most people that are aware of such spiritual methods know that this is definitely possible because they themselves have done it. So these things about healing and exorcism, they're not things that only Jesus can do. And we know this from the scriptures themselves because Jesus gave his apostles the ability to do exorcisms. He initiated them in the ability to do exorcism and healing. So, and all of us, if we learn properly from a teacher, can do the same. As Jesus said, there will be many that do greater things than I have done. That kind of an idea. So all humans are capable of healing other humans. But it's ideal to learn how to heal yourself first before you go out into the world and try and heal others. As presiding Bishop Louis Kaiser's teacher, Mother Jenny, said, a very beautiful phrase that I will always remember, you can only do what you know. You can only teach what you know, I believe was her exact phrase. You can only teach what you know. So you can't heal somebody else unless you've known healing within yourself. You can't guide somebody to spiritual awareness if you don't have some spiritual awareness in yourself.